Bob Herbert's OpEd.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. David Dinkins and I became good friends after his mayoralty, so I was personally extremely sad when he died last November. He passed away just a little more than a month after he lost his wife of 67 years, his beloved Joyce Dinkins. The last time I spoke with the mayor, he said, "She's gone, Bob. My bride is gone." We're going to talk about David Dinkins and his times and his long friendships with Basil Patterson, Percy Sutton, and the former Congressman Charles Rangel. My guest for this excursion is Basil Patterson's son, the former governor of New York, David Patterson. Governor, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Bob. I'm glad to be here. If I look like I was just in a fight with Mike Tyson, it was more that I made contact with the pavement after slipping on the ice.
The last time I saw Mike Tyson, I would put my money on you in that battle.
Yeah, I think I could take him now. I mean, the old Mike Tyson, I wouldn't have messed with.
You know, I had thought that you had known David Dinkins since you were a child, that you had grown up with him, which of course ended up, after I spoke with you a little while ago, not to have been the case. How did you meet David Dinkins? And can you describe how you got to know him and what you thought of him initially?
Well, my parents would talk at the dinner table. So David Dinkins and Lloyd Dickens, spelt differently, and Percy Sutton, and these names would always come up. But when I was 11 years old, my father ran for the state Senate, and he was on a reform ticket with a man named Franz Leichter, who was a state senator from the West Side for many years, served with me in the end. And Franz Leichter's opponent was David Dinkins. So we were actually, in 1965, which was a reapportionment year, we were actually tearing down David Dinkins' posters and advocating for Franz Leichter. So David Dinkins wins the assembly seat, and then eventually, about 3 or 4 years later, I'm sitting at the dinner table. My mother says, "Well, that's great. When is Dinkins going to start?" And my dad said, "Oh, probably in a couple of weeks." I said, "Start where?" He says, "Well, he's coming to our law firm." I said, "Isn't this the guy we were tearing the posters down for?" I didn't understand at that age that after elections, you kind of shake hands, and particularly when you're in the same party, and move on. And that was really quite shocking to me. And so when he came to work in my father's law firm, then I got to know him and his wife and his sons, David and his daughter, Don. I got to know them all.
So that was initially the strange bedfellows concept. You were initiated into it personally.
I couldn't understand why they ever spoke to this guy, you know. And I guess when I was 11 or 12, and I would ride in the sound truck, but I was, either they're with us or against us. I certainly changed over the years, I'm happy to say.
Right. So your dad, Basil Patterson, along with Percy Sutton, and as I mentioned, Charles Rangel, and also David Dinkins, they became great friends, legendary friends, in fact, often referred to in subsequent years as the Gang of Four. How did they come to be so close?
I think that in the beginning, there were some rivalries, and they were running against each other and competing with each other, because we had these 4 very uniquely talented men right in the same neighborhood. And that could sound like a windfall, which it did become for Harlem. But in its early stages, they had to mature and understand each other's abilities. But I think in 1970, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell was running for re-election. He hadn't come to the district at all for the last 2 or 3 years. An almost unknown candidate named John Young almost beat him, or it came close, in 1968. And I think they all agreed that Powell had to go. So they united behind Congressman Charles Rangel, and that was how it was accomplished. My father was running for lieutenant governor with Arthur Goldberg at the head of the ticket at the time, so he couldn't formally endorse. But they had realized that Harlem needed new leadership.
The I encountered these fellows, and you mentioned that they were uniquely talented, and they were, and for them all to be together the way they were geographically and together in time was extraordinary. Now, I encountered them when I was a young reporter for the Daily News, and back in those days, I guess Rangel was in Congress. I think Percy Sutton was the Manhattan Borough president at that time. And your dad was a major labor negotiator and federal mediator. These were really strong-willed and, as you pointed out, uniquely talented individuals. Can you talk just a little bit about the difference in their personalities? Because they weren't in any way all the same, although they had some similarities when it came to talents and interests. Can you
Well,
talk a little bit about their differences and their similarities?
in the Italian Revolution of 1848, which I know you'd be shocked why it would make me think of this, they said that Mazzini was the mind, Cavour was the soul, and I think that Basil Patterson, Percy Sutton was the mind,
Right.
Basil Patterson was the soul, David Dinkins was the heart, and Charlie Rangel was the sword. And
Wow.
there were four great
That's
leaders.
the first time I've heard that. I love that.
Yeah, there were four leaders of the Italian Revolution in 1848. I read about this in high school, but I thought about it when I thought of them. I think that Percy Sutton was the creative thinker. He was he would take chances. He was the one that made sure he knew all the politicians, Republican and Democrat, you know, liberal or conservative. He tried to make relationships with them. I think that Basil Patterson was kind of the soul. He was the one who always, his point of view was always the one that they followed. He had a sense, could read situations better than just about anyone I've met. And Charlie Rangel, he was the fighter. He took on Adam Clayton Powell. You weren't supposed to do that.
That was
And
very
he became a
controversial.
congressman. Then he took on Nixon, and you know, he took on Reagan, and he even got into it with Obama when he didn't think we should have gone into Libya. So he didn't lose any of that fire, even in his older age. And David Dinkins, in the end, I think, was the heart. He was the one who kept the group together. He was the one who really was the face of the group so often as the first African-American mayor, and tried 3 times and finally won for borough president of Manhattan. And I think that he was the one who truly loved them all. And when I called him to tell him my father had died, he unleashed about 30 seconds of expletives. And I said, look, my father died, but you don't have to kill the messenger, you know? and that's how I see their relationship.
Right. You know, I want to talk about David Dinkins and his mayoralty, but before we get to that, let's talk briefly about your dad, because I was fascinated back in those early years, and I guess I'm talking about the 1970s now. But when he was a labor mediator, and what struck me at the time, and I didn't know him well, I got to know him somewhat better later, but what struck me at the time was that people always wanted him as mediator, and that meant that both sides felt that they could trust him and that they would have a tremendous amount of respect for him. Well, I was getting very used to the rough and tumble politics of New York, which at times, you know, was basically of a cutthroat variety. What was it about your dad, who did have strong political feelings and views, and who was a politician as well? What was it that made him agreeable to all sides when these major disputes came up?
You know, in my years in politics, I don't think I understand it to this day. but my father was very much the activist. Uh, he was right there with any cause. Um, he was supportive of people that I think, many of his friends didn't necessarily like. And yet, when he was thinking about running for mayor in 1985, the Conservative Party of New York met with him because they thought that he was someone they could work with. And just in case he did run, they wanted to have a good relationship with him. And I'm
Wow.
shaking my head as how this could actually happen.
I mean, that it's just really incredible.
Well, that's
Now,
why when I said he was the soul of the movement, there was a kind of a morality about him. He always seemed to find a place and take a position that even if you didn't agree with it, you had to respect it.
right. Now, Dinkins ran for mayor in 1989. Well, before we get to that, we've been talking about these four great friends. Before Dinkins ran for mayor, I'm talking about several years before that, it was generally thought that one of these four men might one day become mayor of New York. I think Dinkins was the youngest of the group. Is it fair to say that people thought that he was the least likely of the four to become mayor?
I think that David Dinkins matured and became a very dynamic leader and strong voice later than the other three. As a matter of fact, the columnist Jack Newfield once said that if the Gang of Four were the Beatles, that Dinkins was Ringo Starr. So, and I think actually that as a result of the difficult work when he was mayor and the heartache of criticism, he became a really dynamic leader and made contributions after he was mayor, many of them as important as the ones that he made when he was mayor. I think he did sort of grow into the leadership of that group, and as they all got older, became sort of the leader of it. But as a younger person, I think he was kind of finding his way. And as somebody
Right.
who got elected to office when I was 31, the great thing about finding your way is that when you make mistakes, they are noticed by the fewest witnesses.
You've led us up to his mayoralty. He ran for mayor in 1989, and it's New York City was to say it was troubled times was an understatement. He was dealt a very difficult hand. And he ran against Ed Koch in the Democratic primary and defeated Koch, and then a very tough race against Rudy Giuliani at the time, and he defeated Giuliani. He took office on January 1st, 1990. Can you talk a little bit about what New York City was like, the atmosphere of the city, as David Dinkins took the helm?
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned, Bob, that he took office on January 1st, 1990, because you hear this all the time. Detractors of the current mayor, Bill de Blasio, say things haven't been this bad with the homelessness and the crime on the subways and the vandalism around the city. Things haven't been this bad since the 80s. And then they attach to it the name David Dinkins. David Dinkins wasn't mayor of New York City for 1 second in the 80s. When
Not
he
for a
came
moment.
in the 1990, we had 2,100 deaths in 1989 in the city. The deaths had risen by 64% since 1985. And Dinkins had still a number over 2,000 in 1990, 1991, it was under 2,000. And by 1992 and 93, when he left office, crime had dropped 25% under his watch.
Almost no one either recognizes or knows or acknowledges that crime went down during the 4 years of Dinkins' mayoralty.
I think because of his very conservative nature when he left office, Mayor Koch and Mayor Giuliani and favorable representation that they had in the media painted the whole crisis around David Dinkins, when in fact crime started spiking in the city of New York right after 1984. And Dinkins was the one who got 6,000 police officers with federal money in his Safe City, Safe Streets program. And those officers did not go on duty until 1995. And the mayor who got the credit for it was Mayor Giuliani. And crime did drop precipitously when Mayor Giuliani came in. But because of the aging out of those who used crack, crack is really what caused the crime wave in the late 80s. As those individuals kind of aged out, crime went down in all the major cities from 1994 to 2004.
Yes, I just want to give a sense of what it was like during the campaign. Now, this is before David Dinkins became mayor. New York was, well, there was this terrible crime problem that you were talking about. New York was racked with racial troubles. You had the killing in Bensonhurst. You had the Central Park jogger case where, in fact, they arrested the wrong people for the attack on that woman. You had the terrible corruption scandals of the Koch administration, tremendous homelessness, and the city was in economic freefall. All of this was before David Dinkins became mayor, and this was what he had to grapple with when he became mayor. And so what I would like to do now is, because I do think that he often gets a bad rap for the 4 years that he was in office, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the achievements of David Dinkins during those 4 years. You've already mentioned the hiring of these police officers, which was critically important, and also the beginning of the drop in crime. Can you talk a little bit about what else he was able to achieve?
Well, he was able to actually start the reconstruction of Times Square. Mayor Giuliani gets credit for that. But it was Dinkins who had been on the board of one of the Times Square service organizations, had wanted to clean up Times Square from before when he became mayor. And it was actually now starting to get the revenues. He had a budget deficit in 1991 that delayed it. But by 1992, he had resources there. He saved the United States Tennis Association Center, the West Side Tennis Club in Queens, that brings in $350 to $400 million in just those 2 weeks that we have the US Open every year.
Michael Bloomberg said that that was one of the best, if not the best, stadium deals of any city in the entire country.
Right.
The tennis stadium deal.
And Mayor Giuliani, who wanted to have credit for it, even though he had nothing to do with it, never went to the tennis center and said that it was built on corruption or something, just very antagonistic, very antithetical to the work of the mayor prior to him. And, this was back in an era when, mayors and governors and presidents try not to criticize each other, but that's a begone era right now.
That is gone. So you had mentioned that your dad had, well, your father had served as a deputy mayor briefly in the first Ed Koch administration.
Correct.
Subsequently, he considered running for mayor, challenging Ed Koch. Can you talk a little bit about why he turned against Koch, but then why ultimately he did not make the run for mayor?
Well, Mayor Koch really fell in love with this idea of being conservative and playing to the people who are sitting in the bleachers, being antagonistic about the shooting of a gentleman on the subway.
Right. The Bernard Goetz scandal.
Right, the Bernard Goetz case, the killing of a 70-year-old woman named Eleanor Bumpers in the Bronx. Michael Stewart was the person on the subway. And every time the Howard Beach case, Koch was absolutely appalling in the way he reacted to that. And he thought that it built his base and built his numbers. And many have come after him and emulated that process. And so my father was his deputy mayor for labor relations, didn't want to have anything to do with that. But 1983, they were talking about my father running for mayor. And I think he would have, had he not found out that he had a heart condition, which led to a triple bypass he had in 1987. And so I don't think he wanted to risk his life and his family to run in 1985. And so after the huge turnout in the primary vote for Jesse Jackson in the 1994 New York primary, the whole idea is that there should be and it happened in 1984, but it also happened in 1988.
Right.
There was really almost like a desire to get my father to either change his mind and run in 1989, or to get the borough president, who was finishing his first term, David Dinkins, to do it. And I think Dinkins hesitated at running for mayor. I think he thought it was beyond his ability, and but he went ahead and did it. Showed a lot of bravery and a lot of courage, and I thought served the city very well. And you know, there's this thing in history where who gets to tell the story. I'm glad you let me tell the story here today, Bob, because as I told you a few days ago, I told all the media outlets what happened during that time, and they didn't put that on the air. But what they put on the air is he was like an uncle to me, and he was a
Right.
person, and they had a wonderful wife. Yeah, all that's true, but he also was a very good mayor.
Right. I think the press has really fallen down in general, not in every case certainly, but in general, I think the press has fallen down in its assessments of the Dinkins mayoralty. You know, we've been talking about these giants, and that's the way I view these four men. And of course, you were surrounded by them, and you've held, among other positions, you've been a state senator, you've been a lieutenant governor, and you've been the governor of the state of New York. Can you talk a little bit about the influence that these men have had on you personally and on your career?
Well, David Dinkins raised the number of minority and women-owned businesses that got procurement from the city to 19%. The first executive order that Mayor Giuliani issued was to destroy the entire program. So when I became governor, I followed the Dinkins protocol to bring minority and women participation at the state level up to 13%. But before I left, I passed a series of laws that would block any further governor from ever doing that, learning a lesson from Mayor Dinkins. Also, I think that Mayor Dinkins really had a feel for the city, and he did not want to look like the Black candidate that was only here for Black people.
Right.
And so, though he brought great diversity through the court systems by appointing Black and brown and women judges, and he also created these business opportunities, he never publicized it. And what I realized is that in 1993, when he ran for re-election, the Black vote was down 9%, not because people didn't like Mayor Dinkins, but he didn't advertise his successes. So in my first week in office as governor, and I told Mayor Dinkins I was going to do this, I appointed 10 minority judges to the state courts in a row,
Right.
and dared anybody to challenge this, because
Right.
I wanted to make sure everyone knew that we needed to have diversity, and we had qualified people to fill those positions.
You know, I wish we had more time. I'm so glad you took the time to talk with us on this. We will have on this program. We will have you on again, as I mentioned, because I want to talk, spend a little time talking about your career. So, Governor, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Bob. As a person who did go work in politics, but was always interested in the media and I did talk radio, and so I've done these things. Many of us who are doing it now really looked up to you back in the 70s and 80s when you were blazing a trail for all of us.
Well, I appreciate that. And to our viewers, that's all we have time for now. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.